Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. This time, we're going to tackle some pretty heavy stuff. Feminism and religion. It's a loaded topic, right? But also so fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Definitely complex.
We've
Uh,
got some great material to dig into for this one. You guys send in some really thought-provoking stuff, academic papers, quotes from some serious feminist thinkers.
right.
We've got Karen Armstrong,
Yeah.
Linda Woodhead, Nawal El-Saadawi,
Mm,
Mary Daly, Simone de Beauvoir.
wow.
It's a real mix, and even some, personal stories.
Yeah, a lot of different angles. I'm excited to dive in.
Me too. I think, the big question we're all wrestling with here is, can religion ever truly be gender equal?
Right, that's it.
Like, are those two things even compatible?
It's the core issue, yeah. I mean, a lot of feminist scholars make a pretty strong argument that religion is, inherently patriarchal at its core.
Right, that it's a system built on, male dominance and the exclusion of women.
Exactly. And the concept of patriarchy is key here, right? It's about power. Who has it, who doesn't? And feminist thinkers argue that religion, the way it's structured, often reinforces those power imbalances.
And you see it everywhere, right? I mean, how many major religions have, like, a mostly male clergy?
Yeah, it's a pretty striking pattern.
Yeah.
Karen Armstrong, she talks about the exclusion of women from the priesthood
Yeah.
as a prime example of how women are marginalized in religious institutions.
And Linda Woodhead, she had this amazing quote about the Catholic Church's resistance to ordaining women. She called it like a deep unease about women's emancipation.
Right.
I thought that was so insightful because it suggests it's not just about specific roles or practices. It's like a fundamental discomfort with women having power, having agency.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if it's always been this way.
Right. Were women always kind of pushed to the sidelines in religion?
It's interesting because Karen Armstrong, she talks about how in early religions, women were often very central figures. Yeah. But then as monotheistic religions came about, with the emphasis on a single male god, the whole balance of power shifted.
Wow, that's a huge shift. What do you think caused that? Was it just theology? Or were there other forces at play?
Probably a bunch of things. Social structures changing, the rise of organized religion as a power center. It's complicated. But that shift had a huge impact on women's roles in religion.
For sure. And it kind of leads into this other point about how religious texts themselves are often interpreted through like a patriarchal lens.
Right. It's like the lens itself is distorting the picture.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Nawal El-Saadawi argues. She says that throughout history, men have reinterpreted religious beliefs to serve their own interests, to maintain male dominance.
So it's not necessarily that the original texts are oppressive, but the way they've been understood and used over time.
Right, exactly.
Can you give an example of how that might play out in like different religions? How do these interpretations get skewed?
Well, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's blatant. Like which passages are emphasized, how interpretations change to reflect the dominant culture at the time. For instance, El-Saadawi points to the Quran's stance on adultery.
Oh, interesting. What does she say about it?
She argues that while the Quran prescribes stoning for both men and women found guilty, in practice, men are rarely punished.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She points out that, in Islam, men have the right to have multiple wives and to divorce easily. Women don't. So the law, even though it seems equal on the surface, gets applied very unequally.
That's a pretty stark example of how religious teachings can be twisted, to serve patriarchal ends.
Right. And it makes you realize we can't just take interpretations at face value.
Hmm.
You got to ask, who benefits from this particular reading? Whose voices are being silenced?
Yeah, like peeling back layers of an onion, isn't it? It's complicated.
For sure. And each feminist scholar brings their own perspective, their own way of peeling those layers.
Right. Like we've got Mary Daly. She's coming at it from a radical feminist perspective.
Right. She goes right for the foundations.
Yeah.
Like she points out that even those stories we learned as kids, like Adam and Eve, reinforce the idea of women being inferior.
Oh, I see.
God creates Adam first in his own image, and Eve is like an afterthought, made from Adam's rib.
Like women are just a copy, not the original.
Exactly. And Daly talks about how this plays out in religious practice, too. Like in the Catholic Church, men are given the mission to preach, while women are given the mission to listen.
It's like men are the authority, women are supposed to be passive.
Exactly. And she argues that this dynamic, it extends way beyond the church. It's in all parts of society.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have Simone de Beauvoir coming at it from a Marxist feminist perspective.
Right. De Beauvoir sees religion as a tool used by the oppressors men to control the oppressed women.
I see.
She argues that religion offers women this false hope of, compensation in the afterlife. Like, if you suffer in this life, you'll be rewarded in the next.
So it's a way to keep women in their place by promising them something better later.
Exactly. She calls it false consciousness.
Yeah.
The idea that people are led to believe things that aren't in their best interest,
Yeah.
that keep them from seeing the reality of their oppression.
Wow, that's heavy. Makes you wonder if those critiques are valid, is there any space for, real empowerment for women within religion?
Right. Or is it always going to be a system that limits women?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And, Linda Woodhead, another scholar in our mix, she actually challenges the idea that religion is always and only about patriarchy.
Oh, interesting. So she's saying there's another side to this.
Yeah. She talks about what she calls religious forms of feminism.
What does that look like? Like in real life?
She uses the example of the hijab. She says some Muslim women see it not as a symbol of oppression, but as a symbol of liberation.
I see.
Like for some women, it allows them to get an education, to work with their parents' approval. It allows them to participate in society, but still adhere to their faith.
So it's about finding agency within the framework of their religion.
Exactly. And it kind of challenges that assumption that religion is always oppressive, right? Maybe there's more nuance to it than we initially thought.
Yeah, it definitely complicates things. I think it's so important to recognize the diversity of experiences within any religion. It's not one monolithic thing. There are oppressive elements for sure, but there are also places where women find agency and power.
It's true. But even with those examples of, like, religious feminism, can we ignore the fact that so many women around the world face oppression justified by religious doctrine?
That's a really important point. We can't just gloss over that reality. Like the sources mentioned the situation in Afghanistan, women facing severe restrictions on their freedom, all justified by a particular interpretation of Islam.
Right. It's a constant push and pull, the potential for empowerment, but also those deep-seated patriarchal structures.
It's complex, no doubt.
Yeah.
And to really understand it, we have to look at specific contexts and really listen to the voices of women within those traditions.
Absolutely. Speaking of specific contexts, Nawal El-Saadawi, she focuses on women's oppression in the Arab world, right?
Right. She draws on her own experiences and observations. And her work is, it's powerful and sometimes controversial.
What are some of the key things she highlights?
Well, she talks about how patriarchal ideology, embedded in some interpretations of Islam, leads to real harm for women. She talks about Arab girls facing sexual aggression, being forced into practices like female circumcision.
That's hard to hear, but important to acknowledge.
Absolutely. And she connects these experiences to, the power structures within certain interpretations of Islam.
Like how? Can you give an example?
Well, for instance, she talks about how some religious leaders use the concept of honor to justify violence against women.
So it's like cultural norms and religious interpretations get all tangled up, and women end up suffering the consequences.
Exactly. El-Saadawi is very critical of those systems of control. She doesn't hold back. And that's why some people see her as, anti-religion, but others see her as this incredibly courageous voice.
Yeah, I can see how her work would be both praised and condemned.
Right. It's challenging. But whether you agree with her completely or not, she forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how religion can be used to justify oppression.
And it's not just Islam, right?
Of course not. This is happening in other religions too. Think about some Christian groups using biblical passages to argue against women's leadership or reproductive rights. It's all connected.
So where does this leave us? We've explored the feminist critique of religion as, inherently patriarchal.
Right.
But we've also seen these glimpses of religious feminism.
Right, where women are finding agency and pushing for change within their traditions.
It feels like we're left with more questions than answers.
Yeah, that's the nature of these deep dives, right? We dig deeper and things get more complex. But that's okay. It's about grappling with these questions, challenging our assumptions, and embracing the nuance.
It's about connecting the dots, seeing the patterns. And what I find really interesting is that religion isn't static. It's constantly evolving, changing, being reinterpreted.
Absolutely. And that's key because it means that religion has the potential to change, to become more egalitarian, more inclusive.
That's a hopeful thought. But it also sounds like a lot of work.
It is. It requires a willingness to really examine those ingrained patriarchal structures and to challenge interpretations that perpetuate inequality.
And it requires listening to the voices of women, Understanding their experiences, their needs. How can we create spaces for them to participate fully, to lead?
Exactly. Those are the questions we need to be asking.
This has been quite a journey so far. It's been thought-provoking, challenging, and ultimately, I think, hopeful. We're seeing the problems, but also the potential for change.
I agree. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
What's one key takeaway you'd want our listener to walk away with from all this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this relationship between feminism and religion is incredibly complex. There are no easy answers. But the key is to engage with it critically, with an open mind, and be willing to challenge assumptions, our own assumptions, and the assumptions we encounter.
I love that. That's a great message.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation so far. It's like, we're standing at this crossroads, two paths. One leads to a future where women have, like, true equality in religion, and the other, it just keeps reinforcing the patriarchy, all that damage.
That's such a powerful image. It really captures that tension we've been talking about, tradition versus progress. But how do we, actually navigate those paths? What choices can we make, to steer things in a more just direction?
I think, step one is just awareness, educating ourselves about how patriarchy shows up in religious institutions and being willing to challenge those norms, whenever we see them.
So it's about noticing the subtle stuff, the language, the assumptions, the ways women are silenced.
Exactly. It's about paying attention, listening to women's experiences,
Mm-hmm.
amplifying their voices.
Right, right. But awareness is just the start, right? What about action? What can we actually do?
Well, we can support organizations, individuals working for gender justice within religious communities. We can speak out against discrimination, advocate for policies that promote equality.
So it's about systemic change, not just changing minds.
Exactly. And that can feel daunting, I know.
Yeah.
But every little action, every voice raised against injustice, it all adds up. It contributes to a larger movement.
You've talked about listening to women's voices, their experiences. What are some of the key things you've learned from the sources?
One thing that really hit me is how diverse those experiences are.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just lump all women in religion together, Their experiences depend on their culture, their denomination, how they interpret their faith.
It's like if you've met one woman, you've met one woman. Right. You can't assume they all have the same beliefs or experiences.
Exactly. So we need to create spaces for dialogue where women can speak for themselves,
Yeah.
articulate their own needs, challenge those assumptions about what it means to be a woman of faith.
The sources mention the hijab debate, how some women are reinterpreting that practice, finding agency. Are there other examples of this kind of reinterpretation resistance?
Oh, absolutely. Countless examples. Women challenging how we read religious texts, reclaiming the stories of women in Scripture, reimagining rituals to be more inclusive, more empowering.
Can you give me a specific example that stands out?
Sure. One that comes to mind is the movement among some Jewish women to reclaim the ritual of mikveh.
Oh, the ritual bath.
Yeah. Traditionally, it's associated with, purification after menstruation. But some feminist groups are reinterpreting it as a celebration of women's bodies, their cycles, a source of renewal, connection, not impurity.
That's powerful. Taking something that was used to control or shame women and turning it into something empowering.
Yeah. It shows how even ancient rituals can be reinterpreted, given new meaning. Tradition doesn't have to be static, it can evolve.
It's like they're weaving new threads into the tapestry of their faith, creating something beautiful and resilient.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. It really speaks to the power of creativity, resilience, even when facing these, deep-rooted systems of oppression.
It is inspiring, but it's hard to ignore the reality that so many women, all over the world, are still denied basic rights, often in the name of religion. How do we reconcile those two things, the potential for empowerment and the suffering that's happening?
That's the challenge, isn't it? I don't think there's a simple answer, but we have to hold both realities. We have to acknowledge the harm that's been done, how religion's been used to justify oppression, but also recognize that potential for change, for healing.
So being honest about the past, but not losing sight of the possibility of a better future.
Yes, exactly. And that honesty means being critical, asking tough questions, challenging those in power who misuse religion to control and oppress.
This is more than just, polite interfaith dialogue, isn't it?
It is. It's about dismantling systems of oppression, calling out injustice, standing with those who are marginalized, silenced.
Takes courage.
It does. Courage, compassion, and a willingness to get uncomfortable.
So if religion is a human construct, like we've been saying, can it be reconstructed in a way that's truly just and equitable for women? Or are feminist goals like fundamentally incompatible with faith?
That's the question, right? And I think the answer depends on the choices we make. As individuals, as communities, do we cling to interpretations that limit women? Or do we embrace a more expansive, inclusive, liberating faith?
It's like we're at a crossroads, and the path we choose will determine the future.
It's powerful, yeah. And it highlights how much agency we have in this. We're not just watching this happen, we're shaping it with every choice we make.
What would you say to someone who feels, overwhelmed by all this? It feels so big. Where do you even start?
Start small. Start where you are. Educate yourself. Have those tough conversations with family, friends, support organizations doing the work. And don't lose hope. Change is possible. But it takes effort and a belief that a better world is out there.
It's like planting seeds, right? You might not see the results right away, but with time and care, they'll grow into something beautiful.
That's a beautiful analogy. And it reminds us that this work isn't about reaching some perfect utopia overnight. It's about taking small steps, planting those seeds, and trusting that we can create a more just and loving world.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've explored so much. The patriarchy in religion, the feminist critiques, the possibilities for change. But it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
There's always more to uncover, right? But that's the beauty of learning. It's a process, an unfolding of new perspectives.
I wonder what our listener is thinking right now. What stands out to you? What questions are you wrestling with? What connections are you making to your own experiences?
Yeah, take a moment to reflect. Let these ideas sink in. You don't need all the answers right now. It's about the journey.
It's amazing, isn't it? We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, but I still feel like we're just scratching the surface. There are so many more questions to explore.
It's true. It just shows you how complex and nuanced this whole topic is.
Okay.
The relationship between feminism and religion, it's multifaceted, always evolving, always open to new interpretations.
And as we wrap up, I keep circling back to that big question we started with. If religion is ultimately a human creation, can it really change? Can it become truly gender equal?
Yeah, that's the core of it, isn't it? That question's been woven through everything we've talked about. And honestly, I think the answer is, well, it's complicated, just like everything else we've discussed.
Right. On the one hand, we see all these incredible women working for change within their own faiths, reinterpreting texts, challenging norms, pushing for equality. It's inspiring.
It really is. It shows us that change is possible, that religion isn't this, like, fixed, unchangeable thing. It's alive. It's shaped by the people who practice it.
But then there's the other side, right? The power structures that resist change, the interpretations that are used to justify, well, frankly, oppression. It can feel really discouraging.
Absolutely. It's this constant tension, progress versus tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ultimately it comes down to the choices we make, individually and as communities. Do we hold on to interpretations that limit women, or do we embrace a more expansive, inclusive, liberating faith?
We're at a crossroads, aren't we? And the path we choose is going to determine the future of religion and its relationship with gender equality.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that we have agency in this. We're not just bystanders. We're active participants, shaping the future of faith with every choice we make.
So as we wrap up, what's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with? What's the seed you hope to plant?
I would say this. The journey toward a more just and equitable world, in religion and everywhere else, it's ongoing. It's not a destination. It's a process. Keep questioning, keep challenging, keep listening, and keep hoping.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope it sparked your curiosity, your passion for justice, and maybe even left you with a little bit of hope. Until next time.